Welcome to Dead Signal. Tonight we have part one of a scarecrow anthology. There are places where the harvest never truly ends, where the fields hide more than just corn, and where the scarecrows aren't just watching the crows. They're watching us. Tonight, 3 stories from the edge of farmland darkness, tales of forgotten bloodlines, cursed soil, and guardians that should never have been built. The Farmer's Watcher's Blood Harvest. The Watcher of the Field. You're watching Dead Signal. Like and subscribe if you dare.
The Farmer's Watchers. Part 1. I thought it was just the wind rustling through the corn, until I realized the stalks were moving against the wind, as if something was walking through them. I arrived at my uncle's farm in late September, the kind of afternoon where the sunlight still clings warmly to the earth, but the air carries that first unmistakable bite of fall. The gravel driveway wound through towering oaks and maples, their leaves streaked with early hints of red and gold. Each step on the loose stones crunched beneath my boots, and the faint scent of damp soil and fallen leaves mixed with the lingering aroma of distant smoke from some neighbor wood stove. The farmhouse appeared suddenly, framed by the fading light. Weathered wood panels and chipped paint gave it a stubborn, enduring look, like it had weathered decades of storms and droughts alike. A porch sagged under its own weight, supporting flower boxes filled with late-season marigolds, their petals drooping slightly from the early chill. I could hear the faint creak of the old roof harmonizing with the occasional whistle of the wind through the trees. My uncle met me at the end of the driveway, wiping his hands on a ragged denim sleeve. "Glad you could make it," he said, his voice carrying that casual warmth typical of him. But beneath it, I noticed the subtle fatigue. Shoulders hunched slightly, eyes shadowed. He had spent weeks preparing the farm for the coming frost, and the work showed on him. Plenty of chores waiting. "You'll see soon enough." I nodded, feeling that familiar mix of excitement and unease that always accompanies returning to this isolated place. There's something about farms in September. The vast stretches of land, the quiet broken only by wind or crows, the way shadows seem to linger and stretch longer than they should. The human mind, left alone in such open spaces, starts to play tricks, or so I tried to convince myself. The interior of the farmhouse smelled of old wood, corn husks, and faintly sweet wood smoke from the kitchen stove. I dropped my bag and followed my uncle through the narrow hallway into the kitchen, where the kettle whistled impatiently. Sunlight filtered through the dusty window panes, casting elongated rectangles on the worn wooden floor. My uncle set out mugs of coffee, and I took a seat at the old table, feeling the grooves carved into its surface by years of use. "Chores today," he said again, though less casually this time. He glanced toward the field, visible beyond the window, "and keep an eye on the scarecrows." I laughed nervously, trying to mask the unease that had begun to grow in my chest. "The scarecrows?" I asked. "They're old tradition," he replied, his tone almost dismissive, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed him. "Crows won't bother the field if they see a proper watchman. Nothing more." The first day passed in a haze of mundane work, checking fences for gaps, stacking hay bales, repairing tools that had rusted over the summer. Every so often, I would catch sight of the scarecrows along the edge of the main field. Simple figures made of old jeans and flannel shirts, straw spilling from their sleeves, and pant legs, burlap sacks for heads with crudely painted eyes. Initially, they seemed harmless, just props, reminders of a season drawing to a close. But that evening, as the sun dipped low and long shadows stretched across the field, I noticed something that tightened my chest. One scarecrow, the one closest to the farmhouse, was not in the same spot as it had been that morning. I froze, the wind carrying a faint rustle through the corn, brushing past me with a sound almost like footsteps. My uncle, noticing my stare, waved it off. "Probably the wind," he said, but the faint unease in his eyes suggested otherwise. Night arrived quickly, heavier than I remembered. The air cooled sharply, carrying the scent of damp leaves and tilled earth. The farmhouse felt alive in a way that unsettled me. The floorboards groaned with every step, and the wind whistled softly through cracks in the walls. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the pulse of the farm in the quiet, the faint creak of the barn doors, the rustle of corn beyond the fields, the occasional caw of a crow, disturbed in the distance. Around midnight, I was roused by a sound that made my heart skip a beat, the soft scraping of something across the gravel path. I sat up, breath caught in my throat, eyes straining in the darkness. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal, a fox, or a raccoon. Yet the sound repeated, soft but deliberate, as though some heavy straw-laden figure was moving inch by inch through the fields. The next morning, I stepped out before sunrise. A thick fog had settled over the fields, blurring the boundaries between earth and sky, corn stalks, and shadow. The scarecrow that had unnerved me was closer again, tilting slightly, facing the house with an unnatural rigidity. My pulse quickened. I blinked, convinced my tired eyes were playing tricks. But no, the change was too precise, too deliberate. I questioned my uncle, casually this time, hoping for reassurance. "Did you move it during the night?" I asked. "No," he said, staring at me for a moment, then diverting his gaze to the horizon. "I stayed in the house all night. You must have been dreaming." I wanted to argue, but I didn't. Instead, I spent the morning watching, noting the slight changes in the other scarecrows along the field. By midday, the unease had coiled tightly in my stomach. Each time I looked away and then back, one of them seemed closer, subtly shifted, as if inching toward the farmhouse. The air seemed heavier, almost charged. Even the wind felt different, carrying whispers of rustling fabric and dry straw. By midweek, the patterns became undeniable. I could swear the scarecrows' heads followed me, tilting slightly as I moved. Shadows in the fields didn't match the angles of the sun. The subtle rustling at night was louder, more deliberate. Sometimes, when I peered through the fog-laden fields, I thought I saw movement, quick, fleeting, almost human-like, disappearing before I could focus. My uncle's behavior changed subtly too. He stopped inviting me into the barns after dark. He lingered longer in the fields, scanning the horizon as though expecting something to emerge from the corn. He stopped talking about the scarecrows entirely, only glancing at them occasionally with a tight-lipped expression. One evening, I wandered toward the edge of the field, drawn by a combination of curiosity and an unshakable dread. The corn stretched like walls of gold, the stalks whispering in the wind. As I reached the scarecrow nearest to the farmhouse, I noticed a shadow that didn't belong. The burlap head, tilted, seemed to catch the last light in a way that mimicked eyes. My stomach churned. Every instinct screamed that I shouldn't be there, but I couldn't tear myself away. The wind shifted suddenly, cold and sharp, carrying the faintest scent of dry straw and something else, faintly metallic, like rusted iron. I stumbled back toward the house, hard hammering, and glanced at the fields once more. The scarecrows stood unmoving, yet every fiber of my being insisted they weren't lifeless. Something about them watched, patient, unmoving, waiting. That night, I lay awake, listening to the soft groan of the floorboards, the scrape of the wind through the remaining corn, the distant cry of a lone crow. My thoughts kept returning to those scarecrows, silent sentinels at the edge of the fields, their painted eyes glinting faintly in the moonlight. And I realized then, fully and utterly, that the farm was not just a place of work or family. It was a place where something ancient and patient waited, something that had learned to watch, to move slowly, deliberately, unnoticed, something that would not let me leave without remembering it.
Blood Harvest Part 1. The crops were dying. He said only a new kind of fertilizer could save them, and that it would cost blood. I first heard about the farm from my grandmother's old letters, hidden in a cedar chest in the corner of her attic. She wrote of a place deep in the southern backcountry, where the air always smelled of dry earth and rot, and where the fields had once been so fertile that neighbors whispered the land was blessed. But the letters spoke of one particular year, a year when the sun scorched the fields for months, the wells ran dry, and desperation twisted men into things they shouldn't be. I found myself drawn there in late September, centuries later, following the old paths she had described, imagining the ghosts of people who had worked the soil under a relentless sun. The house was weathered, sagging in the heat, boards warped from decades of neglect. The front gate creaked as I pushed it open, and the overgrown path to the barn rattled under my boots, each step sending echoes across the empty fields. The farm belonged to a family whose name I knew only from history books, the Harrows. They had been well regarded once, their crops a lifeline for the small town nearby. But during the Great Drought, rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers that the patriarch had begun to do things no decent man would do to save the harvest. People claimed they saw the scarecrows he erected along the edges of the fields twitching in the moonlight. Others swore they heard the softest whispers, like wind carrying someone's murmured pleas. I arrived in the early evening. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty fields. The rows of scarecrows were numerous, not the harmless, straw-stuffed figures of children's stories, but tall, imposing figures clothed in heavy, weathered fabrics, heads fashioned from burlap sacks crudely stitched together. They leaned slightly, swaying even when the wind was still. Something about them made the hairs on my neck rise. The caretaker of the farm, an elderly man who barely spoke, guided me through the fields. He explained basic layout, mentioning the scarecrows casually, almost apologetically, as if they were a nuisance rather than guardians. They're just part of the farm, he said, but his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the ropes, holding one of them upright. His eyes darted constantly, scanning the horizon, as though he expected something or someone to emerge from the dusk. As I walked among the scarecrows, the air felt thick and heavy. Each step kicked up dry dust and the brittle remains of corn stalks, and the faint metallic tang of rusted farm tools lingered under my nose. Even the sky seemed wrong, a bruised purple, with clouds low and heavy, like the weather itself was pressing down on the earth. That night, I stayed in the small guest room of the farmhouse. A lantern flickered against the walls, casting long, uneven shadows that seemed to twist with every gust of wind. The house creaked, settling unevenly, but I could swear there were other sounds, soft, deliberate, like someone moving through the halls when no one should be awake. I told myself it was just an old house reacting to the night, but as midnight approached, I could no longer ignore it. From my window, the scarecrows appeared to move, subtly but unmistakably. One's arm, thick with straw and heavy cloth, shifted slightly as if adjusting its stance. Another's head turned, or so it seemed, to face the house directly. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, blinking rapidly, convinced I was hallucinating. Yet the movements continued. The caretaker had warned me not to wander at night, citing old superstitions and the dangers of the fields after dark. But curiosity overpowered caution. I slipped on a cloak and stepped outside, letting the dirt and dry corn crunch beneath my boots. The scarecrows were taller than I remembered, looming in the fog that had begun to settle across the field. The air was thick with the smell of earth, straw, and something faintly coppery, like rusted iron. I couldn't place it, and I didn't want to. It was then I noticed the first signs of the farm's darker past. Scattered among the scarecrows were small patches of dark, dried residue at their bases, stains in the soil that were too irregular, too dark to be mere water or mud. I bent down for a closer look, my stomach twisting, but the caretaker's warning echoed in my mind. Some things are better left unseen. Over the next few days, subtle horrors unfolded. The scarecrows seemed to reposition themselves slightly each morning. Shadows in the field stretched in impossible directions, and at night, faint whispers carried on the wind, sometimes almost forming words, sometimes dissolving into rustling fabric and dry leaves. One evening, while exploring near the edge of the property, I stumbled upon an old journal buried in the dirt under one of the scarecrows. Its pages were brittle and yellowed, filled with frantic handwriting. It spoke of the drought, of the crops dying, and of desperate measures taken to save the land. There were references to sacrifices, strange rituals, and a new fertilizer that can make the fields flourish again, at a terrible cost. My pulse quickened as I read, the reality settling in. This was not just superstition. The scarecrows were not mere symbols. They were the product of something unnatural, tied to acts of desperation, acts that no one in the nearby town dared to mention openly. As night fell, the shadows grew longer, the wind picking up. The scarecrows, silent and unmoving to the casual eye, seemed to watch my every movement. Each rustle of dry straw sounded like footsteps. Each shifting shadow hinted at something crouched, ready to strike. I realized with a sinking certainty that the farm itself was alive in a way I couldn't understand, and that I was now part of its dark rhythm. I spent the night wide awake, listening to the faint whispers and the soft scrape of straw against the earth. Every so often, a chill would sweep through the room, carrying with it the metallic tang I had smelled in the field. I pulled the blankets around me, shivering, unable to shake the feeling that I was being studied, judged, and waited for. By the time the sun rose, the fog had lifted, revealing the rows of scarecrows standing perfectly still, but I knew the truth. They had moved. One or two, just slightly, had shifted overnight, and I understood that this was only the beginning. The farm held secrets older than I could imagine, and I was intruding on them. Something had been awakened. Something patient, deliberate, and hungry. And I wasn't sure I would leave the farm unmarked.
The Watcher in the Fields, Part 1. It started as a simple scarecrow at the edge of the cornfield. By the time I realized it wasn't what it seemed, it had already begun to change, and I was trapped in its gaze. The letter arrived on a gray, gusty morning, pressed under my door like it had been waiting, patient and deliberate. My uncle's name was foreign to me, inked carefully at the top. I had never met him, never heard anything beyond murmured remarks at family gatherings. Recluse, an eccentric, a man who never married, yet here was a formal notice. I had inherited his farm, a sprawling estate nestled deep in the countryside, far from the city I had grown accustomed to. I didn't know what to expect. A modest patch of land, overgrown fields, something abandoned, left to crumble quietly. The drive alone seemed a trial, stretching along narrow, decaying roads that twisted and turned through dense forests. The sun hovered low in the sky, bruised with shades of amber and gray, filtering through the trees in streaks of dim light. The air carried that first chill of fall, crisp and biting, mingled with the smell of wet leaves, turned earth, and a faint metallic temps that I could not place. A smell that seemed to linger in my nose long after I had passed. With each mile, the gravel under my tires seemed to crunch louder, like a warning. When I finally arrived, the farmhouse appeared suddenly, small and worn against the vast backdrop of fields. Weathered panels sagged and cracked, paint curled and flaked, stubbornly clinging to the warped wood. The roof bowed in the middle, and the porch leaned at an angle that seemed unnatural. Windows were opaque with grime, reflecting the fading light in dull streaks. Beyond the house, fields of corn stretched endlessly, already browned with the turn of the season, and at the far edge of the largest field stood the scarecrow. At first, it seemed innocuous, straw stuffed into faded overalls, a burlap sack for a head, a simple stitched smile. I laughed nervously at the absurdity of it, the tension I had carried all the way from the city. Yet the moment my eyes met it, I felt a subtle, inexplicable weight settle in my chest. Something about it was off. Not outright malevolent, not yet, but undeniably aware. The first night in the farmhouse was oppressive. Floorboards groaned beneath every step, the wind howled through cracks and gaps, and the house seemed to sigh with its own breath. Sleep was fractured, filled with half-heard noises. Rustlings outside, the whisper of straw in the wind, shadows flickering beyond the edge of my candlelight. I pressed my face to the pillow, trying to convince myself it was imagination. But I caught a glimpse of the scarecrow through the window, its burlap head angled slightly, its posture impossibly rigid. My heart raced as if it knew I had noticed. Morning brought subtle, disturbing changes. The scarecrow seemed taller, its shoulders broader, its stance more deliberate. Corners stood bent inward, as if bowing. Animals avoided the fields entirely. My dog growled at the edge of the corn, ears flat, hackles raised, refusing to cross. Birds circled above, but never landed. Each time I walked the perimeter, I swore the scarecrow's head shifted slightly, turning toward me, just enough to make my stomach twist. Days turned into weeks, and the evolution continued. Its arms stretched imperceptibly longer, shoulders widening, its burlap head distorting. Each morning brought new anomalies. The corn didn't bring sparks to work. Shadows clung unnaturally to its frame, and a subtle pressure seemed to hang in the air, as if the land itself acknowledged the presence at its center. I explored the farmhouse and barns obsessively. Hidden beneath floorboards, tucked behind cupboards, I discovered old journals and letters from my uncle. Frantic, rambling handwriting described the watcher, rituals, sacrifices, patient growth of the forgiven. Some passages were coherent, others cryptic, filled with symbols and circular sketches, patterns I couldn't yet understand. One line changed. It waits, watching us. The fields bend to it, and those who do not respect its gaze are defeated. Sleep was impossible. Dreams became endless corridors of corn under bruised twilight skies. Shadows moved independently of light. The scarecrow loomed impossibly tall, whispering words I almost understood, pressing into my chest like cold, invisible hands. I woke, drenched in sweat, certain that something had shifted in the field while I slept. Footprints, disturbed soil, slight changes in position that defied explanation. The weather seemed complicit. Fog rolled low across the fields, thick and clinging, obscuring the ground beneath my feet. The sun hesitated to fall across the field, leaving the watcher perpetually bathed in a golden haze. Even wind carried messages, faint whispers in the rustle of corn stalks, carrying syllables I could almost parse. As the scarecrow continued to evolve, its presence became inescapable. The burlap head stretched and shifted, its arms grew wider, filling more of the field. Crops leaned toward it as if drawn by some unseen gravity. Shadows lengthened and twisted around it, independent of natural law. The air itself felt heavier, charged with an unnameable energy, pressing against me whenever I approached. I became obsessed. Every waking thought revolved around the farm and the figure at its center. I measured distances, observed minute changes, and watched for patterns. scarecrows carefully placed, faint markings etched in the soil. My uncle's journals implied that generations had observed this figure, each witnessing its slow growth and subtle demands. The watcher was older than I, evolving across decades, centuries perhaps, awaiting someone to inherit the farm, and awakening it further. The psychological pressure was relentless. Every whisper, every movement of shadows, every rustle of the corn amplified my awareness, my fear, and my obsession. The scarecrow's evolution was undeniable. Taller, broader, impossibly powerful. Its burlap head, warped into intricate patterns of stitching I couldn't comprehend. It was no longer a simple farm object. It was a presence, godlike, patient, waiting. By the end of the first month, I realized something terrible. I had not merely inherited a farm, I had inherited a godlike entity, ancient and aware, tethered to the land itself. And now, I too was bound. My thoughts, my fear, my very life, entwined with the watcher in the fields. I had become part of the awakening, whether I wanted to be or not.